The ping of a new ride request broke the monotony of my late-night shift. I'd been scrolling mindlessly through my phone, parked in a 24-hour fast food lot, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The app showed the pickup location, a red pin dropped in the middle of nowhere, at least 20 minutes outside the city limits. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. The fare would be decent, sure, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was the hour, 2:37 a.m., or maybe it was the location so far from the usual bustling streets I cruised. But rent was due in a week, and my account was running on fumes. I tapped accept before I could talk myself out of it. The city lights faded in my rearview mirror as I drove down the empty highway. Street lamps became scarce, leaving only my headlights to cut through the darkness. The radio signal grew weaker until static overtook the late-night talk show I'd been half listening to. My GPS guided me onto a narrow road that snaked through dense woods. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I slowed down, squinting to make out the path ahead. Finally, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside. As I pulled up, my headlights illuminated a man in his mid-30s wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Thanks for coming out here," he said as he climbed into the back seat. His voice was gruff, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "I know it's a bit out of the way." "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual while eyeing him in the rearview mirror. "Where are we headed?" He gave me an address that the GPS placed in an old industrial area near the docks. I punched it in and pulled back onto the road. "Long night?" I asked, attempting small talk to ease my growing unease. "You could say that," he muttered. I caught his eyes in the mirror. They were bloodshot and darting around nervously. We lapsed into silence. The only sounds were the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional ping from my phone as we got closer to the city. As we entered the outskirts, the passenger leaned forward. "Actually, can you take a different route? Go down Miller Street instead." I frowned. Miller Street would add at least 15 minutes to the trip. Sure. Any particular reason?" "Just prefer it," he said curtly. "I'll make it worth your while." I nodded and made the turn onto Miller. The street was lined with shuttered storefronts and graffitied warehouses. A few figures huddled in doorways, but otherwise the area was deserted. My passenger's leg bounced up and down rapidly. Every few seconds he'd glance out the rear window. "Everything okay back there?" I asked, unable to keep the tension from my voice. "Fine," he snapped. "Just drive." We were about halfway down Miller when I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far back, but closing fast. The passenger saw them, too. He swore under his breath. "Speed up," he ordered. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on, but—" I said speed up. He leaned forward, and I felt something press against the back of my seat. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the barrel of a gun. I hit the gas, the engine whining as we accelerated down the empty street. The headlights behind us grew larger. "Turn here!" the passenger yelled, pointing at an upcoming alley. I wrenched the wheel, tires squealing as we careened into the narrow passage. Dumpsters and fire escapes flashed by in a blur. We burst out onto another street, this one lined with decrepit warehouses. "There!" the passenger shouted, indicating a massive structure looming ahead. "Pull in there!" As we neared, I saw other vehicles parked haphazardly around the building, their headlights off. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, moving with purpose. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. What had I gotten myself into? A drug deal? Some kind of heist? Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt about 50 yards from the warehouse. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "What?" the passenger snarled. "I said get out, now. Ride's over." I felt the gun press harder into my seat. "Drive to the warehouse, or I swear to God, I'll—" He never finished the threat. A blinding light suddenly flooded the car's interior as multiple vehicles surrounded us, their high beams blazing. Car doors opened and slammed shut. Voices shouted commands, overlapping in a cacophony of noise. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" "Exit the vehicle slowly." "Drop your weapon." My passenger let loose a string of curses. The gun disappeared from my back. I raised my trembling hands, placing them on the steering wheel where they'd be visible. "I'm the driver," I called out, my voice cracking. "I'm not armed. I'm just an Uber driver. Oh God, please don't shoot." "Exit the vehicle with your hands up," a stern voice commanded. Slowly, I opened my door and stepped out, hands held high. Multiple red dots from laser sights danced across my chest. I'd never been so terrified in my life. "On your knees, hands behind your head." I complied, sinking to the rough asphalt. Cool metal encircled my wrists as an officer cuffed me. All around, chaos erupted. Officers swarmed the warehouse. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass filled the air. Somewhere a gun went off, a sharp crack that made me flinch. I was hauled to my feet and led to a police van. As we passed my car, I saw my passenger being wrestled to the ground, his face pushed into the pavement as an officer zip-tied his hands. The next few hours passed in a blur. I was taken to a police station, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in an interrogation room. I must have told my story a dozen times to various stone-faced detectives. Yes, I was just an Uber driver. No, I had no idea what was going on. Yes, that was the first time I'd met the passenger. No, I didn't know anything about the warehouse or the other people there. Finally, a tired-looking detective entered the room and removed my handcuffs. "Looks like your story checks out," he said. "We've confirmed you're registered with Uber and your passenger vouched that you weren't involved. You're free to go, but we'll need you to come in tomorrow to sign an official statement." I nodded numbly, too drained to speak. As he led me out, my curiosity got the better of me. What was all that about?" The detective sighed. "Your passenger was part of a human trafficking ring we've been tracking for months. That warehouse was their distribution center. You inadvertently drove him right to the bust. My knees went weak. Human trafficking, the words echoed in my head, making me feel sick. "Hey," the detective's voice softened a bit. "You did good keeping your cool back there. Could have gotten real ugly if you'd panicked." I managed a weak nod. "We'll have an officer drive you home, get some rest, and maybe stick to daytime driving for a while, yeah?" Outside, the sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking over the city skyline. As I slid into the back of a police cruiser, I couldn't help but think about all the what-ifs. What if I'd declined that ride request? What if we'd stuck to the original route? What if I'd reacted differently when I realized something was wrong? I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city slowly come to life as we drove. Delivery trucks made their rounds. Early morning joggers hit the sidewalks. Street vendors set up their carts. All these normal, everyday sights suddenly seemed precious. I'd stepped into a hidden, dangerous world tonight, one that existed right alongside this ordinary one, and somehow made it back out. As we pulled up to my apartment building, I made a silent vow. I'd keep driving. I still had bills to pay after all, but no more late-night pickups in sketchy areas. No more ignoring my instincts when they told me something was off. I'd been given a second chance, and I intended to make the most of it. But first, I needed about 12 hours of sleep and the strongest cup of coffee known to man. Climbing the stairs to my unit, I felt the weight of the night finally hit me. I was exhausted, shaken, but also fiercely glad to be home. As I fit my key into the lock, I paused, taking a deep breath. Tomorrow, I'd deal with the police statement and all the implications of what had happened. But for now, I was going to shower off the night's events, crawl into bed, and be deeply, profoundly grateful for the mundane safety of my own four walls. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and for the first time since that fateful ride request came through, I felt like I could breathe again. Story 2. The neon vacancy sign flickered like a dying firefly, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot. I squinted at the rundown building, its paint peeling in the humid night air, and fought the urge to get back in the car and keep driving. But fatigue weighed heavily on my eyelids, and the thought of another hour on the road made my head spin. "What do you think, babe?" I asked, turning to Sarah in the passenger seat. She yawned, stretching her arms above her head. "Honestly, Tom, I don't care if it's a cardboard box at this point. I just need to lie down." I nodded, killing the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. As we stepped out of the car, the muggy air clung to my skin like a damp cloth. The office was a small, dimly lit room that smelled of stale cigarettes and pine-scented cleaner. A heavy-set man with thinning hair sat behind a scratched Formica counter, his eyes glued to a tiny TV playing some late-night infomercial. He didn't look up as we entered, the bell above the door announcing our presence with a tinny jingle. "Evening," I said, approaching the counter. "You got any rooms available?" The man's eyes flicked towards us, then back to the TV. $35 a night, cash only. I fished out my wallet, counting out the bills. As I handed them over, I noticed the man's gaze lingering on Sarah. There was something unsettling in his eyes, a hunger that made my skin crawl. I instinctively moved closer to her, clearing my throat. "We'll take it," he grunted, sliding a key across the counter. The fob was a cheap plastic rectangle with the number 13 stamped on it. Of course. "Checkout's at 11, he muttered, his attention already back on the TV. As we turned to leave, I felt the weight of his stare on our backs. Through the grimy window, I could see his reflection watching us intently. I quickened my pace, guiding Sarah out of the office with a hand on the small of her back. Our room was at the far end of the building, tucked away in a corner. The key stuck in the lock, requiring some jiggling before the door finally swung open with a protesting creak. The smell of mildew and cheap air freshener assaulted my nostrils as we stepped inside. 2 queen-sized beds dominated the space, their faded floral comforters straight out of the 1970s. A battered dresser stood against one wall, topped by an ancient tube TV. The bathroom door hung slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of stained tile and a rust-ringed bathtub. Sarah flopped onto the nearest bed with a sigh. "It's not the Ritz, but it'll do." I forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. "Yeah, it's just for one night. We'll be back on the road before you know it." As Sarah rummaged through her overnight bag, I found myself drawn to the window. The curtains were thin and yellowed with age, offering little privacy. I peered out into the darkness, my eyes scanning the nearly empty parking lot. A flicker of movement caught my attention. There, in the office window, I could just make out the silhouette of the manager. He was standing perfectly still, staring directly at our room. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly pulled the curtain shut, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The long drive and unfamiliar surroundings were playing tricks on my mind. "I'm going to grab a quick shower," Sarah announced, disappearing into the bathroom. Left alone, I paced the small room, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The walls seemed to press in around me, the air thick and stifling. I tried to distract myself by flipping through channels on the TV, but the reception was terrible, each station a mess of static and ghostly images. The sound of running water from the bathroom provided a soothing white noise, and I felt myself starting to relax. Maybe I was overreacting. This was just a rundown motel, nothing more. We'd sleep, wake up early, and put this place in our rearview mirror. A sharp gasp from the bathroom snapped me back to attention. "Sarah?" I called out, moving towards the door. "Everything okay?" There was a pause before she responded, her voice tight. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, can you come here for a sec?" I pushed the door open, a cloud of steam billowing out. Sarah stood wrapped in a towel, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders. She was staring at the mirror, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, following her gaze. The mirror was fogged up from the shower, but someone had clearly written something in the condensation. 4 words stood out in stark clarity. "Get out. Not safe." My blood ran cold. "What the hell?" Sarah's voice trembled. It wasn't there when I got in the shower. I only noticed it when I was drying off." I ran my hand over the message, smearing it away. Maybe it's just some stupid prank, kids or something. But even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. The unease I'd felt earlier came rushing back, stronger than ever. Sarah hugged herself tightly. "Tom, I don't like this. Can we just go?" I nodded, already moving back into the main room. "Yeah, let's get out of here. Get dressed. I'll pack up our stuff." As I shoved our belongings haphazardly into our bags, my mind raced. Who could have written that message? The manager. But he'd been in the office the whole time. A previous guest? But why? And how recently? A soft click made me freeze. It took me a moment to identify the sound. A key turning in a lock. Our lock. I lunged for the door, grabbing the handle just as it started to turn from the outside. I threw my weight against it, slamming it shut. There was a muffled curse from the other side, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. "Sarah!" I yelled, my heart pounding. "We're leaving. Now." She emerged from the bathroom, clothes hastily thrown on, eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" "Someone just tried to get in," I said, grabbing our bags. "We need to go." I cracked the door open, peering out into the night. The parking lot was empty, no sign of our would-be intruder. Taking Sarah's hand, I led her quickly to our car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. As I fumbled with the keys, a floodlight suddenly illuminated the lot, momentarily blinding us. Squinting against the glare, I saw a figure emerge from the office, the manager moving with surprising speed for his size. "Hey!" he called out, his voice gruff. "Where do you think you're going?" I shoved our bags into the back seat, practically pushing Sarah into the car. "Change of plans," I shouted back, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're checking out early." The man's face twisted into a scowl. "You can't do that. I've already charged you for the night." "Keep the money," I said, sliding into the driver's seat. "We're leaving." As I turned the key in the ignition, my heart sank. The engine sputtered weakly but refused to turn over. I tried again and again, each attempt more desperate than the last. "Having some trouble?" the manager asked, now only a few yards away. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Why don't you come back inside? We can sort this out." Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Tom," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I met her gaze, seeing my own terror reflected in her eyes. In that moment, I knew we couldn't stay here. Whatever was going on, whatever sick game this was, we had to get away. "Run," I said, throwing open my door. We burst out of the car, sprinting towards the highway. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, the manager shouting something I couldn't make out over the pounding of blood in my ears. The highway loomed ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Without slowing, I waved my arms frantically, praying the driver would see us. The car, an old pickup truck, slowed as it neared, the driver's confused face visible through the windshield. I didn't give him a chance to stop completely, yanking open the passenger door and all but throwing Sarah inside before scrambling in after her. "Drive!" I yelled at the startled man behind the wheel. "Please, just drive!" Whether it was the panic in my voice or the sight of the manager charging towards us, the driver didn't hesitate. He stomped on the accelerator, the truck's tires squealing as we peeled away. As we sped down the highway, leaving the motel far behind, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Sarah was pressed against me, shaking uncontrollably. I held her close, murmuring soothing words I didn't really believe. The driver, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, glanced at us in the rearview mirror. "You two okay? What happened back there?" I shook my head, still struggling to process everything. I don't know. Something wasn't right about that place." He nodded gravely. "That old Pinewood Motel? Been hearing strange stories about it for years. You're not the first folks I've seen running from there in the middle of the night." A chill ran down my spine at his words. How many others had found themselves in our situation? And how many hadn't been lucky enough to escape? As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, I held Sarah closer, silently vowing to never again stop at a roadside motel without thoroughly checking it out first. Some bargains, I realized, come at a price far higher than money. And sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're the ones handing you the room key. Story 3. The scratching sound was barely audible over the diesel pump, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, and fatigue was setting in hard. But in that moment, as I stood alone in the flickering fluorescent lights of the truck stop, I was wide awake. I'd pulled into this place out of desperation. My eyelids had been drooping for the last hour, and I knew I was pushing my luck. The 24-hour truck stop sign had been a beacon of hope, a chance to refuel both my rig and myself before tackling the final stretch to Denver. But as soon as I'd killed the engine, I'd felt uneasy. The lot was deserted except for one other semi parked at the far end, its cab dark and silent. The store itself looked closed, despite the lit-up sign. No other cars, no movement, just an eerie stillness broken only by the quiet hum of the fuel pump. I tried to shake off the feeling as I started refueling. It was 2 a.m., of course the place was dead. I was just jumpy from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But then I heard it, that faint scratching coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty lot. The sound seemed to be coming from a nearby trailer, unhitched and sitting alone in the shadows. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was rhythmic, almost desperate. My first thought was rats. Lord knows I dealt with enough of those vermin in my years on the road. But this sound was different, heavier, more deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as my mind conjured up images of what else it could be. I knew I should ignore it. Finish fueling up, grab some coffee from the vending machine if it was working, and get back on the road. But curiosity got the better of me. I found myself walking towards the trailer, my footsteps echoing in the empty lot. As I got closer, the scratching grew louder. It was definitely coming from inside the trailer. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. What the hell was I doing? This wasn't my trailer, wasn't my problem. For all I knew, I was about to release a bunch of angry feral cats into the night. But something in the desperation of that sound tugged at me. What if someone was trapped in there? I'd heard stories of human trafficking, of people smuggled across borders in these very types of trailers. My conscience wouldn't let me walk away without at least checking. I took a deep breath and reached for the latch. It was then that I heard it, the low rumble of an engine coming to life. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The other semi, the one I'd assumed was empty, now had its headlights on full beam, blinding me momentarily. The engine revved aggressively, and I stumbled back, my eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden brightness. The truck started moving, slowly at first, then picking up speed. It was heading straight for me. Panic surged through my body as I realized I was trapped between the oncoming truck and the trailer. I dove to the side, rolling under the trailer just as the truck roared past, missing me by inches. I lay there, gasping for breath as the truck screeched to a halt. The scratching in the trailer above me had stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear car doors opening, footsteps approaching. "You shouldn't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, friend." The voice was gruff, threatening. I couldn't see the speaker from my position, but I could see his boots as he walked around the trailer. I stammered, trying to think of an explanation that wouldn't get me killed. "You were just leaving," another voice cut in. This one was closer, and I could see a pair of worn work boots stop right in front of my face. "Ain't that right?" I nodded vigorously, even though they probably couldn't see me. "Yes, sir, just leaving. Didn't mean to cause any trouble." There was a long pause, and I held my breath, waiting for their next move. Finally, the first voice spoke again. "Get your ass out from under there and get back to your rig. You got 10 seconds before we decide you're more trouble than you're worth." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled out from under the trailer, keeping my head down as I half ran, half stumbled back to my truck. I could feel their eyes on me the whole way, but I didn't dare look back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I threw it into gear and peeled out of that truck stop like the devil himself was chasing me. It wasn't until I was back on the highway, putting miles between me and whatever the hell I'd just stumbled into, that I allowed myself to breathe normally again. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The scratching, the aggressive truck, the threatening men. It all pointed to something illegal, something dangerous. Human trafficking, drug smuggling. I didn't know, and a large part of me didn't want to know. I debated calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I heard a weird noise and some guys scared me? I had no proof, no real information. And if those men were part of something bigger, something organized, the last thing I wanted was to get involved. So I drove on, pushing my rig to its limits, desperate to reach Denver and put this whole night behind me. But as the miles ticked by, I couldn't shake the memory of that scratching sound. It haunted me, that desperate rhythmic noise. What if someone had been in there, counting on me to help them? What if I'd just left them to God knows what fate? The guilt gnawed at me, battling with my fear and self-preservation instinct. By the time I reached Denver, I was a mess of conflicting emotions. I knew I should report it, tell someone what I'd seen. But the trucker's code of minding your own business was deeply ingrained in me. Plus, there was the very real fear of retaliation. Those men had seen my face, my truck. It wouldn't be hard for them to find me if they wanted to. In the end, I compromised with my conscience. After unloading my cargo and checking into a motel for some much-needed rest, I used the motel's computer to send an anonymous tip to the state police. I gave them the location of the truck stop and a brief description of what I'd seen and heard. I don't know if they ever investigated or if anything came of it. Part of me hopes they did, that maybe someone was saved because of my tip. Another part hopes they dismissed it as a prank call, because the alternative, that I'd stumbled onto something truly sinister and done nothing to stop it, was too hard to bear. That night at the truck stop changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I started avoiding isolated stops, sticking to busier routes in well-lit areas. I never again felt truly at ease during those long, lonely night drives. But more than that, it made me realize how thin the veneer of normalcy is in our world. How just beneath the surface of our everyday lives, there are dark currents running, hidden dangers lurking. We go about our routines thinking we understand the world around us, but the truth is, we're often just one wrong turn away from stumbling into something we're not prepared to face. I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing has ever affected me quite like that night. Sometimes when I'm driving late and I pass a lone trailer in a dark lot, I find myself straining to listen, half expecting to hear that scratching sound again. And sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder, what if I had opened that trailer? What if I had been braver or more foolish? Would I have saved someone, or would I have sealed my own fate? It's a question I'll never know the answer to, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that every time I see a missing persons poster or hear a news story about human trafficking, my mind goes back to that night, to the desperation in that scratching sound, to the menace in those men's voices. And I wonder, not for the first time, if I made the right choice. But then I remind myself that I'm still here, still driving, still providing for my family. And in this line of work, sometimes that's the best you can hope for. You can't save everyone, can't right every wrong. Sometimes all you can do is keep on driving, keep on surviving, and hope that somewhere along the way, you've done more good than harm. So that's what I do. I keep driving, keep moving forward. But I never forget, and I never stop listening for that scratching sound in the night. Story 4. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie red glow across the rain-slicked parking lot. We'd been driving for hours, the storm growing more intense with each passing mile. When we spotted the Seabreeze Motel, it felt like a lighthouse guiding us to safety. We had no idea it would be anything but. I killed the engine, and for a moment Sarah and I just sat there listening to the rain hammer against the roof of our old Civic. Lightning flashed, illuminating the motel's peeling paint and overgrown landscaping. It wasn't exactly the Ritz, but at this point any port in a storm would do. "Ready to make a run for it?" I asked, eyeing the distance to the office. Sarah nodded, pulling her hoodie tight around her face. "On 3, he?" I counted down and we burst out of the car, sprinting through the downpour. By the time we reached the awning, we were both soaked to the bone. A bell jingled as we stumbled into the office, bringing with us a gust of wind and rain. The place smelled of stale cigarettes and lemon-scented cleaner. Behind a cluttered desk sat an older woman with frizzy gray hair, engrossed in a dog-eared paperback. She glanced up, seeming almost surprised to see customers. "Help you?" "We need a room for the night," I said, water dripping from my clothes onto the worn linoleum floor. The woman, her name tag read Gladys, set down her book and pulled out a thick ledger. "Single or double?" "Double, please," Sarah answered, wringing out her ponytail. Gladys scribbled in the ledger, then turned to a pegboard of keys behind her. She plucked one off its hook and slid it across the desk. "Room 213, up the stairs, end of the hall on your right. That'll be $65 even." I handed over my credit card, trying not to wince at the price. It was steep for a place like this, but beggars couldn't be choosers. As Gladys ran the card, I noticed the number on our key, 217. "Excuse me," I said. "I think there might be a mix-up. You said room 213, but the key says 217. Gladys frowned, peering at the key through thick-rimmed glasses. "Huh, must have grabbed the wrong one." She turned back to the pegboard, muttering to herself. After a moment, she shrugged. 213's not available after all. 217 will have to do. Same rate. Something about her tone seemed off, but I was too tired to argue. We just wanted to get dry and get some sleep. We thanked her and headed back out into the rain, hurrying up the external staircase to the second floor. The concrete walkway was slippery and the metal railing was so cold it almost burned to touch. Room 217 was at the very end of the building. The paint on the door was chipped, revealing layers of colors underneath like geological strata. It took some jiggling, but eventually the key turned in the lock. The door creaked open and we were hit by a wave of musty air. I fumbled for the light switch and a dim bulb flickered to life, revealing a room that had seen better days. The wallpaper was peeling in places and the carpet had worn patches that hinted at its original color. "Home sweet home," Sarah said with a weak smile, dropping her duffel bag on one of the twin beds. I set our suitcase on a rickety-looking chair and went to check out the bathroom. The fixtures were old but seemed clean enough. I turned on the tap, relieved to see the water run clear after a moment of rusty sputtering. "At least we'll have hot showers," I called out to Sarah. When I came back into the main room, I found her standing by the window, peering out through a gap in the heavy curtains. "This storm isn't letting up anytime soon," she said. I joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. Beyond the glass, the world was a blur of wind-whipped rain and occasional flashes of lightning. The parking lot below was nearly empty save for our car and a couple of battered pickup trucks. A loud crack of thunder made us both jump. Sarah laughed nervously. "Guess we picked a hell of a night for a road trip, huh?" I kissed her forehead. "Could be worse. At least we're not camping." We set about getting ready for bed, both of us eager to peel off our damp clothes. Sarah took first crack at the shower while I channel surfed, finding nothing but static on most stations and grainy images on the rest. As I waited for my turn in the bathroom, I noticed something odd about the bed sheets. They seemed rumpled, as if someone had hastily made the bed. I pulled back the comforter on the bed nearest the door. My stomach dropped. There, on the white sheets, was a large rust-colored stain. "Sarah," I called out, my voice tight. "You might want to see this." The bathroom door opened, releasing a cloud of steam. Sarah emerged, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping. "What's wrong?" I gestured to the bed. Her eyes widened as she took in the stain. "Is that blood?" "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not sleeping on it. Let's check the other bed." We pulled back the covers on the second bed. The sheets there were clean, but as we did so, something fluttered to the floor. Sarah bent to pick it up. It was a small, torn piece of paper. She turned it over in her hands, and I saw her face go pale. "What is it?" I asked. She held it out to me with trembling fingers. It was a photograph, or part of one. It showed a woman's face, her eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. The image was grainy, like it had been taken with a cheap camera in low light. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered. I nodded, already moving to grab our bags. "I'll go to the office, tell them there's a problem with the room. You stay here and—" A sharp knock at the door cut me off mid-sentence. We both froze, staring at each other in panic. "Housekeeping," a muffled voice called from the other side. I frowned. "At this hour?" Sarah shook her head vehemently, clutching her towel tighter. I held a finger to my lips and crept towards the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "There's no one there," I whispered. Another knock, louder this time. "Open up, please. Need to change the sheets." The voice was closer now, as if whoever it was had their mouth right up against the door. I stumbled backward, grabbing Sarah's arm. "The window!" I hissed. "We need to go. Now." We rushed to the window, yanking open the curtains. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the glass and sheets. I struggled with the latch, my fingers slipping on the wet metal. Behind us, the knocking had become a pounding. The whole door shook in its frame. "Almost got it," I grunted, finally feeling the latch give way. I shoved the window up and a gust of wind and rain burst into the room. "Wait," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the storm and the increasingly frantic pounding. "Our stuff. Leave it!" I climbed out onto the narrow ledge, reaching back to help Sarah. "We'll come back for it once we're safe." Sarah hesitated for a split second, then grabbed my hand. As I pulled her through the window, we heard a tremendous crash from inside the room. The door had given way. We didn't look back. Clinging to the slippery ledge, we inched our way towards the staircase at the end of the building. The wind tore at us, threatening to peel us off the wall. Sarah's towel was long gone, leaving her exposed to the elements in just her underwear. Finally, we reached the stairs. We clambered down them as fast as we dared on the wet metal. As soon as our feet hit the parking lot, we ran for our car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. Come on, I muttered. Jake, Sarah's voice was tight with fear. Look. I glanced up. Silhouetted in our room's window was a figure, unnaturally tall and thin. As a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, I caught a glimpse of pale, elongated features and eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. The key finally turned. We dove into the car, and I jammed it into reverse before the door was even fully closed. Tires squealing, we peeled out of the parking lot and onto the highway. For miles we drove in silence, both of us shivering. From cold or fear, I couldn't tell. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, and I had to squint to make out the road ahead. "Should we go to the police?" Sarah finally asked, her voice hoarse. I shook my head. "And tell them what? That we ran away from a spooky motel? That we saw a monster in the window? They'd think we were crazy, or on drugs. So what do? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. We keep driving, put as much distance between us and that place as we can, and we never ever talk about this again. Sarah nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. We lapsed back into silence, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the rumble of thunder in the distance. As the adrenaline began to wear off, questions started to flood my mind. What exactly had we stumbled into? Who was the woman in the photograph? And what would have happened if we hadn't made it out of that room? Part of me wanted answers. A larger part never wanted to think about this night again. The storm gradually began to ease, and hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. As the sky lightened, the events of the night began to feel almost dreamlike. But the goosebumps on my arms and Sarah's haunted expression told me it had all been terrifyingly real. We drove on, leaving the Seabreeze Motel and its secrets far behind us. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that the memory of room 217 would haunt us for years to come. Story 5. The radio crackled with static as I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires. Dispatch, this is Officer Reeves. I'm 23 at mile marker 117. Over. The night pressed in around my patrol car, the darkness beyond my headlights absolute. I squinted through the windshield, barely making out the silhouette of an abandoned vehicle ahead. Copy that, Reeves. Proceed with caution. Over. I clicked off the radio, my hand lingering on the mic. Something about this didn't feel right. In my 15 years on the force, I'd responded to hundreds of calls about abandoned vehicles. But this one had my cop instincts screaming. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit me like a slap, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something metallic. I swept my flashlight across the ground, the beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw them. Marks in the gravel leading away from the road. Not tire tracks, not footprints. Something had been dragged. My hand instinctively went to my holster as I approached the abandoned car. It was a late-model sedan, dark blue. Nothing remarkable about it at first glance. But as I got closer, details began to emerge that set my teeth on edge. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of forced entry. The interior light had either burned out or been disabled, leaving the cabin in darkness. I played my flashlight over the vehicle's exterior, looking for any signs of an accident or foul play. That's when I noticed the windshield. From a distance, it had appeared intact, but up close, I could see a spiderweb of cracks radiating out from a single point of impact. Whatever had hit it had done so with tremendous force. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "This is the police. Is anyone there?" Only the chirping of crickets answered me. I circled the vehicle slowly, my senses on high alert. The trunk was closed, but something about it drew my attention. Crouching down, I ran my fingers along the seam where the trunk met the body of the car. There was a slight gap, as if it hadn't been closed properly. My heart rate picked up as I stood, reaching for the trunk release. Part of me didn't want to know what was inside, but I had a job to do. I took a deep breath and popped the latch. The trunk swung open with a creak that seemed to echo in the night. I steeled myself, then shone my flashlight inside. Empty. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, but my relief was short-lived as I noticed something odd about the trunk's interior. The carpet lining was askew, pulled back in one corner. Curious, I tugged at it, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Inside was a single leather glove. I frowned, picking it up carefully. It was expensive, the kind of glove you'd expect to see paired with a high-end suit. But what caught my attention was the dark stain on the palm. I didn't need the crime lab to tell me it was blood. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight's beam. I whirled around, my hand flying to my weapon. "Police, show yourself!" Silence. I scanned the tree line, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment I thought I saw movement, a shadow darker than the surrounding night. But when I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. Turning back to the car, I decided to check the interior. The driver's side door opened with a soft click. I leaned in, sweeping my flashlight across the seats. No signs of a struggle, no personal belongings left behind. It was as if the car had been sanitized. I was about to pull back when something caught my eye. There on the steering wheel was a single, perfect fingerprint. In all my years on the force, I'd never seen anything like it. The print stood out clearly against the dark leather of the wheel, as if it had been carefully placed there. Almost like a signature. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. This wasn't just an abandoned car. This was a message. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, but as I keyed the mic, all I got was static. Frowning, I tried again. Nothing. That's when I noticed the signal bars on my phone had disappeared too. Out here in the middle of nowhere, that wasn't entirely unusual. But combined with everything else, it felt deliberate. I was cut off, alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I needed to get back to my cruiser, to call this in and get some backup out here. Whatever was going on, it was way above my pay grade. As I straightened up, movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. There at the edge of the woods stood a figure, tall, unnaturally still, watching me. "Police!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. "Don't move!" The figure didn't react, didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, a black silhouette against the slightly less black forest. I took a step forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But before it could illuminate the figure, a gust of wind whipped through the trees. Leaves swirled in the air, momentarily obscuring my vision. When they settled, the figure was gone. My heart hammered in my chest as I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I backed up slowly, keeping my gun trained on the spot where the figure had been. Cold sweat trickled down my back as I fumbled for the door handle of my cruiser. Once inside, I locked the doors and tried the radio again. Still nothing but static. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, silently praying to hear the engine roar to life. The cruiser started without hesitation, its familiar rumble bringing a wave of relief. I threw it into drive, ready to get the hell out of there and call for backup from somewhere with a signal. That's when I saw it. In my rearview mirror, a face. Just for a second, illuminated by my taillights. A face that didn't look entirely human. I slammed on the gas, tires squealing as I peeled away from the scene. In my mirror, I could see the abandoned car receding into the distance. And next to it, barely visible in the fading red glow of my taillights, a tall, dark figure, watching me go. The drive back to the station was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The strange marks on the ground, the perfectly placed fingerprint, the figure in the woods. None of it added up to anything that made sense. As soon as I was back in radio range, I called it in. Told them about the abandoned vehicle, the signs of a potential crime scene. But I left out the parts that I couldn't explain, the parts that made me question my own sanity. The next day, a full team was sent out to investigate. They found the car right where I'd left it. But there was no fingerprint on the steering wheel, no hidden compartment in the trunk, no leather glove. The official report chalked it up to a routine case of an abandoned vehicle. The owner was eventually located. He claimed the car had been stolen weeks ago. Case closed. But I knew better. In the weeks that followed, I found myself unable to shake the memory of that night. The face in my mirror, the figure in the woods, the feeling that I'd brushed up against something unexplainable. I requested a transfer soon after. Couldn't stand working that stretch of highway anymore. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that inhuman face burned into my mind. And I wonder, what if I hadn't driven away that night? What if I'd stayed to investigate further? Would I have uncovered the truth behind the abandoned car and its mysterious watcher? Or would I have become just another unsolved disappearance, another mystery for some other cop to puzzle over on a dark, lonely night? I don't know the answer, but I do know one thing. Sometimes the real mysteries aren't the ones we solve. They're the ones that haunt us, lingering in the back of our minds like shadows at the edge of a flashlight beam. Always there, just out of sight, waiting for us to look a little closer. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we drive away before we see too much, before we learn truths we're not ready to face, because once you've seen behind the curtain, there's no going back. You carry that knowledge with you, a weight that never quite leaves your shoulders. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely highway and you see something that doesn't quite add up, my advice? Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't investigate. Just keep moving and be grateful for the mysteries you don't solve. Because trust me, there are some questions you don't want answered. Story 6. The weight of the package seemed to increase with every mile, as if it knew the danger it was putting me in. I never should have accepted this delivery, but the promise of a big payday had clouded my judgment. Now, as I weaved through traffic with a black SUV bearing down on me, I realized some things aren't worth any amount of money. It was supposed to be a routine job. As a motorcycle courier in the bustling heart of Los Angeles, I was used to zipping through gridlocked streets, delivering everything from legal documents to organ transplants. But when a well-dressed man approached me outside my usual coffee spot with an offer I couldn't refuse, I should have known better. $5,000 for a single delivery, he'd said, his eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. No questions asked. I'd hesitated, but only for a moment. My rent was due, and my bike needed repairs I couldn't afford. $5,000 would solve a lot of problems. Where to? I'd asked, already knowing I was going to say yes. He'd handed me a small unmarked package and an address on the outskirts of the city. Deliver it by noon, don't be late, and don't open it, understand? I'd nodded, tucking the package into my courier bag. It was heavier than it looked, about the size of a hardback book. As the man walked away, I'd felt a twinge of unease, but I'd shaken it off, telling myself it was just nerves. Now, as I zigzagged through cars on the 405, that unease had blossomed into full-blown panic. I'd noticed the black SUV about 10 minutes into my ride. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as I changed lanes and took exits, it stayed with me, always a few cars back, but never losing sight of me. I'd tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but when I'd made a sudden turn onto a side street and saw the SUV screech around the corner after me, I knew this was no coincidence. They were after the package, and they were willing to run me off the road to get it. My heart pounded in my chest as I wove through traffic, pushing my bike to its limits. I'd always prided myself on my riding skills, but I'd never had to use them like this before. The SUV was bigger and more powerful, but I was more agile. I used every trick I knew, every shortcut and alley I'd discovered in my years of navigating LA's concrete jungle. But they were good. Every time I thought I'd lost them, they'd reappear in my mirrors, closing the distance. I could see two men in the front seats now, their faces set in grim determination. The driver's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, and I saw something there that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't just about the package. They weren't planning on letting me walk away from this. I made a sharp turn onto Wilshire Boulevard, my tires squealing in protest. Cars honked as I threaded between them, but I couldn't worry about angry drivers now. I needed to think, to find a way out of this mess. What was in this package that was worth killing for? Drugs, weapons, state secrets? My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. But it was too late for that now. I was in this whether I liked it or not. I spotted a gap in traffic and gunned the engine, shooting forward. For a moment, I thought I might have gained some ground. But then I heard the roar of an engine behind me, and the SUV burst through the gap, scattering cars in its wake. They were done playing cat and mouse. The SUV accelerated, coming up alongside me. I could see the passenger reaching for something, and my blood ran cold. Were they really going to shoot me in broad daylight on one of LA's busiest streets? I didn't wait to find out. I spotted an alley coming up on my right and made a split-second decision. I leaned hard, my knee almost scraping the pavement as I took the turn at full speed. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for my bike. There was no way the SUV could follow. I heard the screech of brakes behind me as I shot down the alley, dodging trash cans and startled pedestrians. My heart was in my throat as I emerged onto another street, quickly scanning for any sign of my pursuers. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them, but then I heard the squeal of tires and the SUV came barreling around the corner. They must have found another way around. These guys were persistent. I had to give them that. I needed a plan. I couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, I'd make a mistake or they'd get lucky, and then it would be all over. As I sped down Fairfax, an idea began to form. It was risky, maybe even suicidal, but it was the only play I had left. I made a hard right onto Melrose, then another quick left. I knew these streets like the back of my hand, and I was counting on that knowledge now. I could see my destination up ahead, the Fairfax High School. Classes would be in session, which meant the parking lot would be nearly empty. It was a gamble, but it was all I had. I leaned low over my handlebars, pushing my bike to its absolute limit. The engine screamed in protest as I hit 90, then 100 miles per hour. The world became a blur around me, but I kept my eyes fixed on my target. The SUV was right behind me now, so close I could hear the roar of its engine over my own. I waited until the last possible second, then slammed on my brakes and wrenched the handlebars to the left. My bike skidded sideways, tires smoking against the asphalt. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to lose control, but years of experience kicked in, and I managed to keep the bike upright as I slid into the school parking lot. The SUV, caught off guard by my sudden maneuver, shot past the entrance. I heard the screech of brakes as they tried to correct, but their momentum was too great. The SUV fishtailed, then flipped, rolling several times before coming to rest on its roof. I didn't stick around to see if they were getting out. I gunned the engine and tore out of the parking lot, taking a complex series of turns to ensure I wasn't being followed. Only when I was certain I'd lost them did I finally slow down, my hands shaking on the handlebars. I pulled into an empty strip mall parking lot, killing the engine and leaning against a wall. My heart was still racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I'd just outrun professional criminals, maybe even killers. And for what? I pulled the package from my courier bag, turning it over in my hands. Part of me wanted to open it to see what all this was about, but a larger part knew that would be a mistake. Whatever was in here, it was better if I didn't know. I checked my watch. It was 11:30. I still had time to make the delivery. But did I want to? After everything that had just happened, did I really want to see this through? In the end, my curiosity and my stubbornness won out. I'd come this far, I might as well finish the job, but I wasn't going in blind again. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search on the delivery address. It was a nondescript office building, seemingly legitimate. But a deeper dive revealed it was owned by a shell company, which was owned by another shell company, and so on. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to hide the true owner. I sat there for a long time, weighing my options. I could walk away right now, ditch the package, go home, and pretend none of this ever happened. But something told me it wouldn't be that easy. Whoever was after this package, they'd seen my face. They might come looking for me. No, I realized with a sinking feeling, I was in this now. The only way out was through. I started up my bike again, my decision made. I'd deliver the package as planned, but I'd be ready for anything. And after this, I was done with the no-questions-asked jobs. Some payments weren't worth the price. As I merged back into traffic, my eyes constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. When I woke up this morning, my biggest worry had been making rent. Now I was caught in the middle of something that felt like it was ripped from an action movie. But this was real life, and in real life, there are no guaranteed happy endings. As I approached my destination, I knew that whatever happened next would change my life forever. For better or worse remained to be seen. One thing was certain, though. If I made it through this, I was going to need a new line of work. Motorcycle courier suddenly seemed far too exciting for my tastes. Story 7. The truck stop was a beacon of fluorescent light in the darkness, a haven for weary travelers and long-haul drivers alike. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, and the promise of hot coffee and a warm meal was too tempting to pass up. Little did I know pulling into that parking lot would thrust me into a nightmare I never saw coming. I eased my 18-wheeler into one of the oversized spots, the air brakes hissing as I set them. The clock on my dash read 2:17 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the grit of too many miles and not enough sleep. Just a quick bite, I told myself, then back on the road to make my delivery on time. The diner portion of the truck stop was surprisingly busy for the hour. A mix of truckers, tourists, and locals occupied the vinyl booths and swivel stools at the counter. The air was thick with the smell of grease and coffee. I slid into an empty booth, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag reading Darlene appeared almost immediately, coffee pot in hand. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked, already pouring me a cup without waiting for a response. "Just the coffee for now," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "And maybe a menu?" She nodded, producing a laminated menu from her apron pocket and placing it in front of me. As she walked away, my attention was drawn to a heated conversation at the counter. Two men sat hunched over their plates, their voices low but intense. One was older, maybe in his 50s, with a scraggly gray beard and a trucker cap pulled low over his eyes. The other was younger, probably mid-30s, clean-shaven with close-cropped dark hair. Something about their body language set me on edge. "You can't back out now," the older man was saying, his voice a harsh whisper. "Everything's set." The younger man shook his head vehemently. "This isn't what I signed up for, Dale. You said no one would get hurt." "Keep your voice down," Dale hissed, glancing around nervously. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I quickly looked down at my menu, pretending I hadn't been listening. Their conversation continued, but they lowered their voices even further, and I could only catch snippets. "Too late to change the plan." "Can't have cold feet now." "Not worth the risk." I tried to focus on the menu, but my ears were straining to hear more. Whatever these guys were planning, it didn't sound good. Darlene returned to take my order, and I asked for a plate of eggs and hash browns, more to have an excuse to stay longer than out of any real hunger. As she walked away, I noticed the younger man stand up abruptly, nearly knocking over his stool. "I'm out," he said firmly, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Find someone else." He stormed towards the exit, shouldering past a group of tourists who had just walked in. Dale remained at the counter, his shoulders hunched, staring into his coffee cup. The next hour passed uneventfully. I ate my meal slowly, nursing my coffee and keeping an eye on Dale. He never moved from his spot at the counter, ordering several refills and checking his phone obsessively. Finally, around 3:30 a.m., he stood up, left some cash on the counter, and headed for the door. Something made me follow him. I waited a few minutes, then paid my bill and stepped out into the cool night air. The parking lot was poorly lit, with deep shadows between the rows of trucks and cars. I spotted Dale's figure moving towards a beat-up pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. As he reached the truck, another figure emerged from the shadows, the young man from earlier. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language was clear. Dale was angry, gesticulating wildly. The younger man stood his ground, shaking his head. Suddenly, Dale grabbed the front of the young man's shirt, pulling him close and saying something directly into his face. The young man shoved Dale away hard, causing the older man to stumble backward. In a flash, Dale regained his balance and swung, his fist connecting with the young man's jaw with a sickening thud that carried across the quiet parking lot. The young man went down and Dale was on him in an instant, raining down blows. I started running towards them, shouting for Dale to stop. But before I could reach them, Dale landed a particularly vicious kick to the young man's head. The victim went limp. Dale looked up, saw me approaching, and bolted for his truck. I reached the young man just as Dale's pickup peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. The victim was unconscious, blood trickling from his nose and a nasty gash on his forehead. I yelled for someone to call an ambulance, and soon a small crowd had gathered. The next few hours were a blur of paramedics, police officers, and questions. I gave my statement, describing what I'd seen and heard in the diner and the parking lot. The officers seemed particularly interested in any details I could remember about Dale and his truck. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the truck stop, a detective pulled me aside. "We've identified the victim," he said, his voice grim. "His name is Marcus Reeves. He's been missing for 3 days." My stomach dropped. "Missing?" The detective nodded. "His wife reported him missing when he didn't come home from work on Monday. We've been looking for him, but had no leads until now." I thought back to the conversation I'd overheard. They were arguing about some kind of plan. The older guy, Dale, he said it was too late to back out. The detective's expression darkened. "We think Reeves might have gotten caught up in something bigger than he realized. Human trafficking, possibly. We've been tracking a ring operating in this area for months." My mind reeled. Human trafficking. The word sent a chill down my spine. I thought about all the times I'd stopped at truck stops just like this one, never imagining the darkness that might be lurking just beneath the surface. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll put out an APB on Dale and his vehicle. As for you," the detective paused, fixing me with a serious look, "I'd advise you to be careful. If Dale realizes you witnessed the assault and talked to us, he might come looking for you." I nodded, suddenly feeling very exposed in the open parking lot. The detective must have sensed my unease because he added, "We can arrange for police protection if you'd like." I shook my head. "I appreciate it, but I've got a delivery to make. I can't afford to stay in one place." The detective handed me his card. "Call if you remember anything else or if you see Dale again. And watch your back out there." As I climbed back into my truck, my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus Reeves and whatever he'd gotten mixed up in. Was he a willing participant who'd had a change of heart, or an innocent person who'd stumbled into something terrible? I pulled out of the truck stop, merging onto the highway as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The open road usually brought me a sense of freedom, but now it felt ominous. Every car that passed, every truck in my rearview mirror could be Dale or one of his associates. For the next several hundred miles, I found myself jumping at shadows, scrutinizing every vehicle that stayed behind me for too long. I kept replaying the events of the night in my mind, wondering if there was something more I could have done, some way I could have intervened sooner. When I finally reached my delivery point and handed over my cargo, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But as I checked into a motel for some much-needed rest, I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. The image of Marcus Reeves lying motionless on the pavement was seared into my memory. I locked and double-checked the motel room door, then wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see, a dark undercurrent running beneath the seemingly mundane world of truck stops and long-haul routes. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a news alert. I picked it up, my heart racing as I read the headline. "Suspected human trafficking ring busted, multiple arrests made." The article mentioned an anonymous tip that had led to the breakthrough. I set the phone down, a mix of relief and unease washing over me. The immediate danger might have passed, but I knew I'd never look at a truck stop the same way again. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now seemed fraught with hidden dangers and untold stories. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I made a silent promise to myself. From now on, I'd keep my eyes open and my ears tuned in. Because sometimes being a witness is the most important cargo you can carry. Story 8. The skid marks always ended at mile marker 237. No matter how many times I drove past, no matter how many accidents I investigated, it was always the same, like some twisted fingerprint left by fate itself. But tonight, as my patrol car's headlights cut through the fog, I knew something was different. Tonight, I'd see the truth behind the whispers, the rumors, the unexplainable. And God help me, I wasn't ready for it. My name's Alex Mercer, Highway Patrol for the last 8 years. I've seen my share of ugly accidents and unexplainable events, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on Route 16. It started about 3 months ago, a string of single-car accidents all clustered around the same stretch of road. At first, we thought it was just bad luck, maybe a slick patch of asphalt or a deceptive curve. But as the weeks went by and the accidents piled up, a pattern emerged. Every crash happened within 100 yards of mile marker 237. Every driver, if they survived, told the same story. A figure on the roadside, appearing out of nowhere. And every time those damn skid marks ending abruptly as if the cars had simply vanished into thin air. I'd been working these cases from the start, and with each new incident, the knot in my gut grew tighter. Something wasn't right here, and I was determined to figure out what. That night, I volunteered for the graveyard shift. The fog had rolled in thick, reducing visibility to near zero. Perfect conditions for another incident. I'd been parked just off the shoulder for hours, engine idling, eyes straining against the darkness. The radio crackled to life, startling me from my vigil. Dispatch to Unit 17, we've got reports of another accident near mile marker 237. Possible 1180. Respond code 3. My heart raced as I keyed the mic. Unit 17 responding, ETA 5 minutes. I flipped on the lights and siren, tires squealing as I pulled onto the empty highway. The fog seemed to part before me, swirling in the wake of my cruiser. As I approached the scene, I could make out the faint glow of taillights ahead. Slowing to a stop, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the mist. The air was heavy, oppressive, carrying the acrid smell of burned rubber and something else, something metallic and familiar. Blood. My beam cut through the darkness, revealing a car crumpled against the guardrail. Steam hissed from the mangled engine, mixing with the fog. I approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello, this is the police. Is anyone hurt?" No response. As I drew closer, I saw why. The driver's side of the car was crushed inward, the metal twisted and torn as if it had collided with something far larger than the guardrail. And there, slumped over the steering wheel, was the driver. I've seen my share of fatalities, but this was different. The man's face was frozen in a mask of absolute terror, eyes wide and staring at something I couldn't see. His hands were locked in a death grip on the wheel, knuckles white against the blood-streaked leather. Fighting back the urge to retch, I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. We've got a confirmed 1180. Send EMS and the coroner." "Copy that, Unit 17. EMS is en route. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. I'd be alone out here for 20 minutes. As I turned back to the wreck, movement caught my eye. There, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something shifted in the fog. I raised my beam, heart pounding. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out, my free hand moving to rest on my holstered weapon. "Is someone there?" The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around my legs like a living thing, and then I heard it, a whisper so faint I might have imagined it. "Help me!" I spun around, searching for the source. "Where are you? Are you hurt? Help me!" Louder this time, coming from somewhere down the road. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I started walking. The fog parted before me, only to close in behind, cutting off my view of the wrecked car. Soon I could barely see a few feet in any direction. "Hello?" I called again, my voice sounding muffled in the thick air. "Where are you?" "Here." I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist, and there, not 10 feet away, stood a figure. It was a woman, or at least it had the shape of a woman, but something was off. Her edges seemed blurred, as if she wasn't quite solid, and her eyes, God, her eyes were black as pitch, reflecting no light. Are you all right?" I managed to stammer, my mouth suddenly dry. She tilted her head in unnaturally fluid motion. "I'm lost," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "Can you help me find my way?" Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, but I stood my ground. "Ma'am, it's not safe out here. There's been an accident. Why don't you come back to my car and we'll get you some help?" Her lips curved into a smile that sent chills down my spine. "But I'm not the one who needs help, Alex." I froze. I hadn't told her my name. "How do you—" Before I could finish, she was gone, vanished into the fog as if she'd never been there. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. What the hell was going on? A screeching of tires cut through the night, followed by the sickening crunch of metal on metal. Another crash. I ran towards the sound, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. As I neared mile marker 237, I saw it. Another car wrapped around a tree that hadn't been there moments before. And there, standing in the road, was the woman. Only she wasn't a woman anymore. Her form shifted and writhed, growing taller, darker. I watched in horror as it transformed into something out of a nightmare. Limbs elongated into impossible shapes, fingers stretching into razor-sharp claws. And those eyes, those terrible, bottomless eyes fixed on me. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my weapon. But before I could draw it, the thing moved. One moment it was in the road, the next it was right in front of me, its face inches from mine. "Why do you chase us, Alex?" It hissed, its breath cold as the grave. "Why do you seek truths you cannot comprehend?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare into those fathomless eyes as the fog swirled around us. "We have always been here," it continued, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "Watching, waiting, feeding on the fear of those who stray too close to the veil." Its clawed hand reached out, hovering just above my chest. I could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into my bones. "You wanted to know the truth, Alex. Are you prepared for what that means?" In that moment, I saw it all. The accidents, the victims, the terror that fed this thing. I saw the thin membrane that separated our world from whatever nightmare realm it came from. And I saw how fragile that barrier truly was. Just as its claws were about to pierce my chest, a sound cut through the fog. Sirens. The backup I'd called for was finally arriving. The creature's head snapped up, its form already beginning to dissipate. "Remember, Alex," it hissed as it faded into the mist. "Some truths are better left unknown." And then it was gone, leaving me alone on the empty road. Moments later, the fog began to clear as emergency vehicles pulled up. Paramedics rushed to the crashed car while my fellow officers approached me with concerned looks. "Mercer? You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, to tell them everything I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? "I'm fine," I managed to croak out, "just shaken up by the accident." As the scene was processed and the victim removed from the wreckage, I found myself staring at mile marker 237. It stood there innocently, just a simple sign on the side of the road. But now I knew the truth. Now I understood the weight of the secret it held. In the days that followed, I requested a transfer to a desk job. I couldn't bring myself to patrol that stretch of highway again. Couldn't bear the thought of encountering that thing once more. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that whisper. Still see those eyes in the darkness of my room, and I wonder how many others have seen what I've seen. How many have glimpsed the truth behind the veil and lived to tell about it. But mostly I wonder about that thing's last words to me. Some truths are better left unknown. And as I sit here jumping at every shadow and flinching at every unexpected sound, I can't help but think it might be right. Because once you've seen behind the curtain, there's no going back. The world never looks quite the same again. And the darkness always seems a little closer, a little hungrier. So if you're ever driving down Route 16 and you see mile marker 237 looming in your headlights, do yourself a favor. Keep driving, don't slow down, don't look too closely at the shadows by the roadside. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some truths can destroy you. Story 9. The gate slammed shut behind me with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. In all my years on the road, I'd never seen a way station quite like this. As I peered through the darkness at the abandoned trucks scattered around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just driven into a trap. It had been a long haul, and I was running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. I'd been pushing hard to make up time after a delay at my last drop-off, and the idea of stopping at this mandatory way station had me gritting my teeth in frustration. But rules were rules, and I knew better than to skip it. Highway patrol had been cracking down lately, and the last thing I needed was a hefty fine eating into my already thin profit margin. So when I saw the "All Trucks Must Exit" sign illuminated in the distance, I'd obediently flicked on my turn signal and steered my rig onto the off-ramp. It was late, nearly 2 a.m., and I'd expected to see at least a few other trucks pulling in with me. But the road was empty. My headlights the only illumination cutting through the inky blackness of the night. As I approached the station, something felt off. The lights were on, but they seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. I couldn't see anyone in the office, which wasn't too unusual for this time of night. Often they'd just have you pull onto the scale and wave you through if everything checked out. I slowed my rig to a crawl, squinting at the faded signs directing me where to go. That's when I noticed the other trucks. At first glance, they looked normal enough, a handful of semis parked in the lot. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized they were parked haphazardly, as if they'd been abandoned in a hurry. Some had their doors hanging open, cabs empty and dark. A voice in the back of my mind was screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But before I could act on that impulse, I heard the ominous clang of metal behind me. My stomach dropped as I glanced in my side mirror and saw the gate slowly swinging shut, effectively trapping me inside the station. Panic started to set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was alone, cut off from the highway, with no idea what was going on. I reached for my CB radio, hoping to call for help, but all I got was static. Either something was jamming the signal or I'd somehow driven into a dead zone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just ram the gate and make a run for it, but even if I could break through, that would be destruction of government property, not to mention fleeing the scene. I'd be looking at serious charges, maybe even losing my CDL. And if this was just some kind of misunderstanding or equipment malfunction, I'd be throwing away my career for nothing. So I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled my rig up to the scale, hoping that going through the motions might trigger whatever automated system was supposed to be running this place. As I inched forward, the floodlights suddenly blazed to life, momentarily blinding me. I blinked away the spots in my vision, and that's when I saw him. A figure was emerging from the shadows of the office building, walking with a slow, deliberate gait toward my truck. In the harsh glare of the lights, I couldn't make out many details, just the silhouette of a man, average height and build. But something about the way he moved set my nerves on edge. I rolled down my window a crack, just enough to call out, "Hey, what's going on here?" The gate closed behind me. The figure didn't respond, just kept walking toward me with that same measured pace. As he got closer, I could see he was wearing some kind of uniform, but it didn't look quite right, like a cheap Halloween costume version of what the DOT guys usually wore. My hand hovered over the door lock as he approached the driver's side. Up close, I could see his face now, and it did nothing to ease my anxiety. His expression was blank, almost robotic, and his eyes, there was something off about them, like they weren't quite focusing on me. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Like hell I will," I shot back, my fear turning to anger. "What's going on here? Where is everyone? Why's the gate locked?" A flicker of something, annoyance, frustration, passed over his face so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, in the exact same tone as before. I was about to tell him where he could stick that request when movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. More figures were emerging from between the abandoned trucks, all moving with that same eerie, synchronized gait. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was wrong, all wrong. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. I threw my truck into reverse, ready to back up and ram that gate if I had to. But before I could move, the man reached out with inhuman speed and yanked my door open. I hadn't even seen him unlock it. Had I forgotten to lock it in my panic? He grabbed my arm with a grip so strong it felt like a steel vise and began to pull me from the cab. I fought back, of course. I'm not a small guy, and I've handled my share of tough situations on the road. But this was different. No matter how hard I struggled, his grip didn't loosen. It was like fighting against a machine. As he dragged me from the truck, I caught glimpses of the other figures closing in. In the stark light of the flood lamps, I could see their faces now. Men and women, young and old, all with that same blank expression. Some were wearing truckers' clothes, others looked like they might have been travelers or locals. But they all moved in that same synchronized way, as if they were puppets controlled by the same unseen hand. I was yelling now, screaming for help, even though I knew there was no one to hear me. The man thing, holding me, didn't react at all to my struggles. He simply began walking toward the office building, dragging me along as easily as if I were a child's toy. As we neared the building, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. From inside, barely audible over my own shouts, came a chorus of muffled screams and pounding. There were people in there, trapped, terrified people. In that moment, the reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about me anymore. Whatever was happening here, whatever these things were, they'd been at it for a while. Those abandoned trucks, the missing drivers. How long had this been going on? How many people had fallen into this trap? With a surge of desperate strength, I managed to wrench my arm free. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, but managed to keep my feet under me. The blank-faced crowd was closing in, cutting off any escape route back to my truck or the gate. The only open path was further into the way station complex. So I ran. I ran like I've never run before in my life, fueled by terror and adrenaline. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps in perfect unison like some nightmarish marching band. I darted between buildings, looking for any way out, any place to hide. And that's when I saw it. A gap in the fence at the far end of the complex. It looked like something had smashed through it at some point, leaving a hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It was my only chance. I poured every ounce of energy I had left into a final sprint. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed through the pain. I could feel them getting closer, their synchronized footsteps like a countdown to my capture. I hit the fence at full speed, not slowing down as I twisted my body to slide through the gap. The jagged edges of the chain link tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt it. I was through, I'd made it, but my relief was short-lived. As I staggered to my feet on the other side, ready to make a run for the highway, I froze in horror. There, blocking my path, was another group of blank-faced figures. And behind them, I could see more trucks pulling into the way station, their drivers unaware of the nightmare they were driving into. As the emotionless crowd closed in from both sides, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was bigger than I could have imagined. This wasn't just one-way station, this was happening everywhere. The highways, the lifeblood of our nation, had become a hunting ground for whatever these things were. The last thing I remember before they overwhelmed me was a feeling of deep, bitter regret. Regret that I hadn't listened to that little voice telling me to turn around. Regret that I hadn't been able to warn anyone. But mostly, regret that I'd never again see the open road, never feel the freedom of the highway stretching out before me. As the blank faces swarmed around me, their cold hands reaching out, I closed my eyes and thought of home. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. The long haul was over. Story 10. The master key felt heavy in my hand as I stood outside room 237. 5 days had passed since the odd guest checked in, and not once had he emerged or allowed housekeeping entry. Something wasn't right, and as the owner of the Pinewood Motel, it was my responsibility to investigate. I never could have imagined the nightmare that awaited me on the other side of that door. My name's Marge, and I've run this roadside motel for going on 30 years now. It's not much, just 20 rooms stretched out in a long, single-story building, but it's mine, and I take pride in keeping it clean and quiet for my guests. Most folks who stay here are just passing through, spending a night or two before moving on, but every once in a while we get someone who lingers. The man in 237 checked in last Friday evening. I remember because it was pouring rain, and he was soaked to the bone when he squelched up to the front desk. He was a big fella, easily over 6 feet tall and built like a linebacker. But despite his size, there was something skittish about him. The way his eyes darted around the small office like he expected someone to jump out at him. "Just need a room for a few nights," he'd mumbled, pushing a wad of cash across the counter. I noticed his knuckles were bruised and scraped. I gave him the key to 237, our most secluded room at the far end of the building. He didn't have any luggage, which I found odd, but I've learned not to ask too many questions in this business. People have their reasons for seeking out places like the Pinewood. The first couple of days passed without incident. I saw his car, an old beat-up Chevy, in the parking lot, so I knew he was still around. But he never came out, never asked for fresh towels, never even cracked the curtains. By day 3, I was starting to worry. I knocked on his door that afternoon. "Housekeeping?" I called out. No response. I pressed my ear to the door and heard water running. "Sir? Is everything all right in there?" Still nothing. I told myself he was probably just in the shower and couldn't hear me. But a nagging feeling in my gut said otherwise. Day 4 and still no sign of him. I knocked again, louder this time. The water was still running. That's when I started to really worry. Nobody takes a shower for 2 days straight. Which brings me to today, standing outside room 237 with the master key in my trembling hand. I'd called the local sheriff's office, but they said they couldn't do anything without evidence of a problem. "He's a paying guest," the deputy had said. "As long as he's not disturbing anyone, we can't just barge in." So here I was, about to do the barging myself. I took a deep breath and slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and I eased the door open, calling out as I did. Hello? Mr. Smith? It's Marge from the front desk. Just checking to make sure everything's okay. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the silhouettes of the two queen beds, both of them untouched. The air was thick and stale, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place. I fumbled for the light switch, and the room was suddenly bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead fluorescent. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was a disaster. Clothes were strewn everywhere, some of them stained dark. The bedside table was overturned, and the mirror above the dresser was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures distorting my reflection. But it was the bathroom that drew my attention. The door was closed, but I could see light spilling out from underneath, along with a thin trickle of water. The sound of the running shower was louder now, a constant hiss that seemed to fill the room. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run back to the office and call the police, but I couldn't leave, not without knowing. I approached the bathroom door slowly, my shoes squishing on the waterlogged carpet. "Mr. Smith?" I called out again, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached for the doorknob, surprised to find it cool to the touch despite the steam. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The rush of hot, humid air hit me like a wall, carrying with it that same unidentifiable scent. Stronger now. Through the fog, I could make out a shape behind the shower curtain. A large, dark mass slumped in the tub. "Oh, God," I muttered, fighting the urge to gag. I knew what I was going to find before I even pulled back the curtain, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. The man, Mr. Smith, or whatever his real name was, lay sprawled in the tub, the water from the shower head cascading over his bloated body. His skin had taken on a sickly, grayish hue, and his eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. But it was the gash across his throat that held my attention, a ragged, dark line that told the story of his final moments. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the bath mat. I went down hard, my elbow cracking against the tile floor. The pain barely registered through the fog of shock and horror that had enveloped me. I don't know how long I sat there on the bathroom floor, staring at the corpse in my bathtub. It could have been minutes or hours. The constant hiss of the shower seemed to drown out everything else, even the frantic pounding of my own heart. Eventually, some semblance of rational thought returned. I needed to call the police. I needed to get out of this room. I needed to... A noise from the bedroom snapped me back to full alertness. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the sound of the shower, but unmistakable. The creak of a floorboard. Someone else was in the room. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. Had I left the door to the room open when I came in? I couldn't remember. My mind raced through the possibilities. A curious guest? One of my staff? Or someone connected to the dead man in my bathtub? The floorboard creaked again, closer this time. Whoever it was, they were approaching the bathroom. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on the toilet plunger propped in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed the plunger and pressed myself against the wall next to the door, my heart thundering in my chest. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. A shadow fell across the sliver of bedroom I could see through the partially open door. Time seemed to stretch like taffy. Each second felt like an eternity as I waited, plunger clutched in my trembling hands for whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door to make their move. The door began to swing open. I tensed, ready to swing my makeshift weapon. But as the figure stepped into view, my arms went slack with relief. "Deputy Carson," I breathed, recognizing the local sheriff's deputy. "Thank God you're here." The deputy's eyes widened as he took in the scene. Me on the floor with a plunger, the body in the bathtub, the general disarray of the room. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said slowly, one hand moving to rest on his holstered gun. "Want to tell me what's going on here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but where could I even begin? How could I make sense of something I didn't understand myself? As I struggled to find the words, I saw something shift in Deputy Carson's expression. The professional concern was replaced by something harder, more calculating. His hand tightened on his gun. "Why don't you come on out of there, nice and slow," he said, his voice tight. "We've got a lot to talk about." It was then that I realized the nightmare was far from over. Whatever had happened in room 237, whatever dark business had brought Mr. Smith to my motel and left him dead in my bathtub, it was bigger than I could have imagined. And now I was caught right in the middle of it. As I stepped out of the bathroom on shaky legs, I caught a glimpse of myself in the cracked mirror. The woman staring back at me looked old and scared, a far cry from the confident motel owner I'd been just hours ago. I had a feeling that woman was gone for good, washed away like so much evidence down the drain of room 237. The deputy ushered me into the bedroom, closing the bathroom door behind us. As he began to ask his questions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a world I knew nothing about, a world where ordinary people like me were just collateral damage in some larger, more sinister game. The hiss of the shower faded into the background, replaced by the sound of approaching sirens. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: life at the Pinewood Motel would never be the same again. Story 11. The moment I stepped into room 213, I knew something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of bleach and something else, something sickly sweet that clung to the back of my throat. But it wasn't the smell that sent a chill down my spine. It was the unnatural cleanliness, the pristine surfaces that seemed to mock the very concept of a lived-in space. In my 20 years of running this roadside motel, I'd seen plenty of strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for the horror that room 213 would reveal. My name's Frank Holloway, owner of the Pinewood Motel just off Route 66. It's not much, but it's been my life for the past 2 decades. I've seen all types come through here: families on road trips, truckers looking for a night's rest, couples sneaking away for a rendezvous. But there was something different about the man in room 213, something that set my teeth on edge from the moment he checked in. It started 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday night if I remember correctly, the kind of night where the crickets seem louder than usual and the flickering neon of the vacancy sign casts eerie shadows across the parking lot. I was half dozing behind the front desk when the bell above the door jangled, startling me awake. He stood there, silhouetted against the darkness outside, tall, unnaturally thin, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel scraping against steel. "I need a room, long-term." I blinked, trying to shake off the unease that settled over me. "Sure thing, mister. How long we talking?" "Indefinitely." He placed a stack of crisp $100 bills on the counter. "I trust this will suffice for now." I counted the money, enough for a month's stay, easy. Against my better judgment, I handed him the key to room 213. "Checkout's at 11 a.m., but since you're staying a while, just let me know if you need anything." He nodded once, sharp and precise, then turned and walked out without another word. I watched through the window as he made his way to room 213, his gait smooth and purposeful. No luggage, I realized. Who checks in for a long-term stay without so much as an overnight bag? The first week passed uneventfully. The man, he never did give me his name, kept to himself. No requests for extra towels or complaints about the temperamental AC. The maids reported that he always hung the "Do Not Disturb" sign on his door. It was during the second week that things started to get strange. Margie, our longtime housekeeper, came to me one morning, her usually cheerful face drawn with concern. "Frank," she said, her voice low as if afraid of being overheard, "there's something not right about that fella in 213. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced around before leaning in closer. I was doing my rounds, yeah? And I could have sworn I heard noises coming from his room, like scrubbing, real vigorous-like. But when I knocked to see if he needed anything, it all went dead quiet. I assured her it was probably nothing, but her words stuck with me. That night, I found myself standing outside room 213, straining to hear any sound from within. Nothing. Not even the hum of the TV or the rustle of movement. It was as if the room was empty. But it wasn't empty. Every few days, I'd catch a glimpse of him, always at odd hours, always moving with that same deliberate grace. He never spoke to anyone, never used the vending machines or ice maker. It was like he was barely there at all. As the third week drew to a close, the complaints started rolling in. Guests in neighboring rooms reported strange odors. Like chemicals, one woman said, wrinkling her nose. Then something else, something rotten. I knew I had to investigate. As the owner, it was my responsibility to ensure the comfort and safety of all my guests. But as I stood outside room 213, key in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something I'd rather not see. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. "Housekeeping," I called out, figuring he'd be less likely to turn away a maid than the motel owner. Silence. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sir, I'm coming in to check on the room condition." Still nothing. With a sense of foreboding, I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open silently, revealing the interior of room 213. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Bleach so strong it made my eyes water. But underneath it, barely detectable, was that sickly sweet odor I'd noticed when he first checked in. Only now it was stronger, more pungent. I stepped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness. The curtains were drawn tight, allowing only a sliver of late afternoon sunlight to penetrate the gloom. As my vision cleared, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The room was immaculate, not just clean, but pristine in a way that defied logic. The bed was made with military precision, not a wrinkle in sight. The carpet looked as if it had been individually cleaned, each fiber standing at attention. Every surface gleamed, free from even a speck of dust. It was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. I moved further into the room, my unease growing with each step. The bathroom door was ajar, and I could see the tiles inside shining like new. Even the grout looked as if it had been scrubbed with a toothbrush. That's when I noticed the trash can. It was the only thing in the room that seemed out of place, overfull and wrapped tightly in a black garbage bag. As I approached it, that sickly sweet smell grew stronger. With trembling hands, I reached out to open it. But before I could touch the bag, a noise from the parking lot made me jump. A car door slamming. Footsteps on gravel. He was back. Panic seized me. I couldn't be found here, snooping through his room. I rushed to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I was about to step out, something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a small dark stain on the carpet. How had I missed it before? I leaned in for a closer look, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't a stain, it was a fingernail. A human fingernail, partially buried in the plush carpet fibers. The footsteps were getting closer. I bolted from the room, barely remembering to pull the door shut behind me. I made it back to the office just as he rounded the corner, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading daylight. Our eyes met for a brief moment. His were dark, bottomless pools that seemed to see right through me. Did he know I'd been in his room? Could he sense my fear, my dawning realization of what might be happening under my very nose? He nodded once, that same sharp motion from the night he checked in, then disappeared into room 213. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my office, a cold cup of coffee in my trembling hands as my mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I had a suspiciously clean guest with a penchant for bleach? That I'd found a fingernail in a motel room carpet? No, I needed more. I needed proof. The next morning, I steeled myself for another confrontation. I don't know what I expected to find. Evidence of some grisly crime, perhaps, or the man himself caught in the act of whatever it was he was doing. But when I opened the door to room 213, I found nothing. The room was empty. Not just of the man, but of everything. It was as if no one had ever stayed there at all. The bed was stripped, the trash can empty. Even the fingernail I'd seen the day before was gone, leaving no trace behind. On the nightstand was another stack of crisp $100 bills and a note. The handwriting was precise, each letter formed with unnerving perfection. "Thank you for your hospitality. I trust you'll find the room to your satisfaction." I stood there, the note crumpling in my grip as the implications washed over me. How many? How many had there been before he came here? How many would there be after? In the weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every guest who checked in. I installed new security cameras, changed the locks, even hired a night manager so I wouldn't have to be alone in the office after dark. But none of it has helped. Because every time I close my eyes, I see that immaculate room. I smell that sickly sweet odor lurking beneath the bleach. And I wonder, when will he be back? So if you're ever driving down Route 66 and you see the flickering neon of the Pinewood Motel, keep driving. Don't stop no matter how tired you are, because you never know who might be in the room next door. And some guests, once they check in, never truly leave. Story 12. The excavator's bucket hit something solid with a sickening crunch, and in that moment I knew our lives would never be the same. What we unearthed that day on the highway expansion site would haunt us all, turning a routine job into a nightmare that consumed everything in its path. I've been in construction for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Long hours under the scorching sun, dealing with impossible deadlines and even more impossible foremen. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what happened on that godforsaken stretch of highway just outside of Millbrook. It started like any other day on the job. I arrived at the site just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, thermos of coffee in hand, ready to tackle another 12-hour shift. We were 3 months into a major highway expansion project, widening a 2-lane road into a 4-lane expressway to accommodate the growing traffic between Millbrook and the state capitol. As I made my way to the command trailer, I nodded to a few of the guys already milling about. There was Big Mike, built like a linebacker and with a heart to match, checking the oil on one of the bulldozers. Skinny Pete was nearby, looking over some blueprints with a furrowed brow. And there, emerging from the trailer with a clipboard in hand, was our site manager, Sarah. "Morning, Sarah," I called out. "What's on the agenda for today?" She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Hey, Jack, we're starting excavation on the new section today. I need you on the big excavator. We've got to clear out that whole area before the end of the week." I nodded, draining the last of my coffee. "You got it, boss." As I climbed into the cab of the massive excavator, I felt that familiar rush of excitement. There's something oddly satisfying about operating these behemoths, feeling the raw power at your fingertips as you reshape the earth itself. I fired up the engine, its low rumble vibrating through my body, and got to work. For the first few hours, everything was business as usual. The bucket rose and fell in a steady rhythm, scooping up earth and depositing it into waiting dump trucks. The morning passed in a blur of motion and machinery. It was just after our lunch break when it happened. I was digging into a particularly stubborn patch of ground when I felt the bucket hit something solid. Now, this wasn't uncommon. We often ran into large rocks or old tree roots. But this felt different. The impact sent a shudder through the entire machine, and I immediately eased off the controls. "Hey, Sarah," I called out, waving her over. "I think we've hit something here." She jogged over, squinting up at me in the bright afternoon sun. "What is it? Another boulder?" I shook my head. "Don't think so. Feels different. Mind if I clear it out a bit more to take a look?" She nodded, stepping back to give me room. I carefully maneuvered the bucket, scraping away the surrounding dirt with as much delicacy as a 30-ton machine can muster. As the earth fell away, I felt my breath catch in my throat. There, partially exposed in the raw earth, was what looked like a human skull. "Oh, Jesus," I muttered, immediately shutting down the excavator. I scrambled down from the cab, my legs feeling weak beneath me. Sarah was already on her phone, her face pale. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice tight. "Nobody touch anything." Word spread quickly through the site. Work ground to a halt as everyone gathered around the excavation area, murmuring in hushed tones. Big Mike looked like he was going to be sick. Skinny Pete just kept shaking his head, muttering, "This ain't right, man. This ain't right." The police arrived within the hour, quickly cordoning off the area with yellow tape. They were followed by a team of people in white coveralls, forensics, I guess. We all watched in stunned silence as they carefully excavated the area around our grim discovery. By nightfall, the true extent of what we'd uncovered became clear. It wasn't just one body. The forensics team had exposed an entire mass grave, at least a dozen bodies from what I could see. The site was transformed into a macabre archaeological dig, floodlights casting long shadows as the team worked through the night. We were all questioned, of course, but none of us knew anything. This stretch of land had been empty fields for as long as anyone could remember. The bodies must have been there for years, maybe even decades. As I drove home that night, my mind was reeling. Who were these people? How did they end up buried beneath a field in the middle of nowhere? And most chillingly, who put them there? Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that skull emerging from the earth, its empty socket seeming to stare right through me. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the sound of earth being shoveled. The next morning, the site was crawling with police and FBI agents. Our construction work was indefinitely suspended pending the investigation. Sarah gathered us all together to break the news. "I know this is hard on all of you," she said, her usual confident demeanor shaken. "The company's arranging for counseling services for anyone who needs it. In the meantime, we're all on paid leave until further notice." Paid leave should have been a relief, but the thought of sitting at home with nothing but my thoughts for company filled me with dread. So when one of the FBI agents approached me, asking if I'd be willing to assist with some of the excavation work, I jumped at the chance. "We need someone familiar with the equipment," he explained, "to help us expose more of the area without disturbing the evidence." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I can do that." For the next week, I worked alongside the forensics team, carefully uncovering more and more of the burial site. With each passing day, the body count grew. 20, 30, 40. It seemed never-ending. But it wasn't just bodies we were finding. Personal effects started turning up: watches, jewelry, scraps of clothing. Each item was carefully bagged and tagged, potential clues to the identities of the victims. As we worked, rumors began to swirl. Whispers of serial killers, mob hits, government cover-ups. The local press was having a field day, and our little town of Millbrook was suddenly the center of a national media frenzy. It was on the 8th day that things took an even darker turn. I was clearing an area at the edge of the site when my bucket hit something metallic. At first, I thought it might be an old car or farm equipment, but as I carefully cleared away more dirt, I realized it was a large metal container, like an oversized footlocker. The FBI agent overseeing my work immediately called for backup. They approached the container cautiously, as if it might explode at any moment. When they finally pried it open, the collective gasp was audible even from where I sat in the excavator's cab. Inside were stacks of documents, photos, and what looked like old videotapes. I couldn't see the contents clearly, but the grim expressions on the agents' faces told me all I needed to know. Whatever was in that box, it was bad. Really bad. That night, as I was leaving the site, I overheard two agents talking in hushed tones. "Goes back decades," one was saying. "Trafficking, extortion, murder, it's bigger than we thought." "How high up does it go?" the other asked. The first agent shook his head. "All the way to the top from the looks of it, state officials, judges, maybe even—" He trailed off as he noticed me walking by. They both fell silent, watching me with suspicious eyes until I was out of earshot. I drove home that night with a sick feeling in my stomach. Whatever we'd uncovered, it was more than just a burial site. It was the tip of an iceberg, a conspiracy that seemed to reach into the highest levels of power. As the days wore on, more and more men in suits started showing up at the site. The local police were gradually phased out, replaced by stern-faced federal agents. The media, which had been swarming the area, was suddenly kept at a distance, fed vague statements about an ongoing investigation, and then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it was over. 2 weeks after we'd made that first gruesome discovery, I arrived at the site to find it completely locked down. A new team was there, men I'd never seen before, overseeing the removal of all the equipment and evidence we'd uncovered. Sarah met us at the edge of the property, her face a mask of forced calm. "The project's been canceled," she announced. "We're to collect our personal belongings and leave immediately. The company will be in touch about reassignments." We all stood there in shocked silence. Skinny Pete was the first to speak up. "That's it? What about all those bodies? What about the investigation?" Sarah just shook her head. "It's out of our hands now. We've all been asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. For our own safety," they said. As I walked back to my truck for the last time, I caught the eye of one of the FBI agents I'd worked with over the past 2 weeks. There was a look of defeat in his eyes, of resignation. He gave me a small nod, and I understood the unspoken message. This was bigger than us. Some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. In the months that followed, life in Millbrook slowly returned to normal. The highway expansion project was quietly shelved. the land fenced off and left to grow wild. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd never guess at the horrors that lay beneath the surface. But for those of us who were there, who saw what we saw, life would never truly be the same. Every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of Big Mike or Skinny Pete around town. We'll share a look, a nod of recognition. We don't talk about it, we can't talk about it, but we remember. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself driving out to that lonely stretch of highway. I'll park my truck and just sit there, staring out at the overgrown field. And I'll wonder about the secrets buried there, about the truths we unearthed and the lies that covered them up again. In the end, I suppose some roads are better left unbuilt, some stones better left unturned. But the weight of what we discovered out there, the lives lost and the justice denied, that's a burden we'll carry with us always, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Story 13. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner flickered weakly in the distance, a lone beacon in the vast darkness of the desert night. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes burning from the endless stretch of highway. As I pulled my rig into the nearly empty parking lot, I had no idea that this routine pit stop would thrust me into a nightmare I never saw coming. The bell above the door jangled as I pushed it open, the smell of coffee and grease hitting me like a wave. It was just past 2 a.m. and the place was deserted save for a single waitress behind the counter. She looked up as I entered, and I caught a flash of something in her eyes. Fear, relief. It was gone so quickly I thought I might have imagined it. "Sit anywhere you like," she called out, her voice steady but lacking the weary cheerfulness I'd come to expect from late-night diner staff. I slid into a booth near the window, my bones creaking in protest after so many hours in the driver's seat. The vinyl seat was cracked and worn, telling the story of countless truckers and travelers who'd sat here before me. The waitress approached, coffee pot in hand. Her name tag read Jenny, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You could say that. What can I get for you?" I ordered my usual. Eggs over easy, hash browns, side of bacon. And she hurried off to the kitchen. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The diner was too quiet, the air too thick with unspoken tension. Jenny returned with my food, setting the plate down with a clatter. That's when I noticed the marks on her arms, angry red scratches partially hidden by her rolled-up sleeves. "Everything okay?" I asked, my concern growing. She glanced nervously towards the kitchen door. "Everything's fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. "I've been on the road for 30 years, and you develop a sense for when things aren't right. This whole situation was setting off alarm bells in my head. As Jenny turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, scrawled hastily on my paper napkin, were 4 words: 'Please help me. Danger.' I looked up sharply, but Jenny was already walking away, her shoulders tense. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she in some kind of trouble? Was there someone else in the diner, someone I couldn't see? I forced myself to start eating, not wanting to raise suspicion if I was being watched. But my eyes scanned the diner, taking in every detail. The scratched-up counter, the flickering light in the far corner, the swinging door to the kitchen that never seemed to settle. Jenny refilled my coffee cup, her movements jerky and nervous. I tried to catch her eye, to silently communicate that I'd seen her message, but she avoided my gaze. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head and she started to turn away. On impulse, I reached out and gently caught her wrist. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Jenny," I said softly, "if you're in trouble, I can help. Just say the word." For a moment, I thought she might break down right there. Her lower lip trembled and I saw tears welling up in her eyes. But then the kitchen door banged open and she yanked her hand away as if she'd been burned. A man emerged from the kitchen, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face like a thundercloud. His eyes locked onto Jenny, and I saw her shrink into herself. "Jenny," he barked, "need you in the back." She nodded meekly and scurried towards the kitchen. As she passed the man, I saw him grab her arm roughly. The look he gave me could have curdled milk. "Enjoy your meal," he said, his tone making it clear that it wasn't a suggestion. The kitchen door swung shut behind them, and I was left alone in the silent diner, my half-eaten meal forgotten. I strained my ears, trying to hear what was happening in the back, but the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I knew I had a choice to make. I could finish my meal, pay my bill, and drive away, pretending I hadn't seen anything unusual. It would be the easy thing to do, the safe thing. But the thought of leaving Jenny here, clearly terrified and asking for help, made my stomach churn. I'd always prided myself on minding my own business. In my line of work, you learn quickly that getting involved in other people's problems usually leads to trouble. But something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the desperation in Jenny's eyes, or the way that man had looked at her like she was property. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't just walk away. I pulled out my phone, thinking to call the police, but there was no signal. Of course not. We were in the middle of nowhere, and cell coverage out here was spotty at best. Just as I was contemplating my next move, I heard a crash from the kitchen, followed by a muffled cry. That was it. I couldn't sit here any longer. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. Taking a deep breath, I walked towards the kitchen door. My heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had no plan, no weapon, nothing but the certainty that I couldn't leave without knowing Jenny was safe. As I pushed through the swinging door, the scene that greeted me was worse than I'd imagined. Jenny was on the floor, a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. The man stood over her, his fist raised for another blow. "Hey!" I shouted, surprising myself with the force of my voice. The man whirled around, his face contorted with rage. "This ain't none of your business, old man," he snarled. "Get back out there and finish your damn meal." I stood my ground, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "I'm making it my business," I said, sounding braver than I felt. "Let her go, and we can all walk away from this." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You don't get it, do you? There's no walking away. Jenny here, she belongs to me. And you? You're just some washed-up trucker who stuck his nose where it don't belong." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jenny slowly getting to her feet. There was a new look in her eyes now, determination mixed with fear. The man noticed too. He started to turn back towards her, but I knew I couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, I charged forward, catching him around the middle and driving him back into the stainless steel prep table. We went down in a tangle of limbs, years of pent-up anger and frustration fueling my attack. I'm not proud to admit it, but in that moment I wanted to hurt him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he'd inflicted on Jenny. But he was younger, stronger, and fueled by a rage I couldn't match. He got in a solid punch that made my vision swim, then another that sent me sprawling on the greasy kitchen floor. As he loomed over me, I braced myself for the beating I knew was coming, but it never came. Instead, there was a resounding clang, and the man's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the ground, revealing Jenny standing behind him, a cast-iron skillet clutched in her shaking hands. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the only sound our heavy breathing and the sizzle of grease on the grill. Then Jenny dropped the skillet and burst into tears. I pulled myself to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ribs, and awkwardly put an arm around her shoulders. "It's okay," I said, though I knew it was far from okay. "It's over now." She shook her head, still sobbing. "It's not over," she choked out. "He'll wake up and he'll come after me. He always does." I looked down at the unconscious man on the floor, feeling a mixture of disgust and pity. "Not this time," I said firmly. "We're getting you out of here." The next hour was a blur of activity. We called the police from the diner's landline, and I gave my statement while Jenny was checked out by the paramedics. The man, her abusive boyfriend, and the diner's owner, I learned, was arrested and taken away in a squad car. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I found Jenny sitting on the curb outside the diner, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "What will you do now?" I asked, lowering myself down beside her. She shrugged, her eyes on the horizon. "I don't know. I've got a sister in Albuquerque. Maybe I'll go there, try to start over." I nodded, reaching into my pocket and pulling out all the cash I had on me. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get her started. "Take this," I said, pressing the money into her hand. "And here's my number. If you ever need anything, day or night, you call me." She looked at the money, then at me, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." I thought about it for a moment, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Because everyone deserves a chance at a better life, I said finally. And sometimes we all need a little help to get there. As I climbed back into my rig a little while later, I watched Jenny in my rearview mirror, standing tall in the morning light. I don't know what became of her after that night, but I like to think that somewhere out there she found her fresh start, and me, I got back on the road as I always do. But something had changed. I drove on with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that sometimes the most important cargo we carry isn't in our trailers, but in our hearts. Story 14. The ping from my Uber app came just as I was about to call it a night. One last ride, I thought. One more fare before I could head home and crash. Little did I know that accepting that ride would plunge me into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I pulled up to the pickup location, I had no idea that the man waiting on the curb was about to become the most terrifying passenger I'd ever encountered. My name's Mike, and I've been driving for Uber for about 3 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and lets me set my own hours. I've had my share of weird rides. Drunk college kids, arguing couples, even a guy who insisted on bringing his pet iguana along. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a Tuesday, just past midnight. The streets of downtown were mostly empty, save for a few stragglers stumbling out of bars and the occasional delivery truck. I'd been driving since 6 p.m. and my eyes were starting to feel heavy. That's when the notification came through, a pickup at the corner of 5th and Main. As I navigated through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Maybe it was the late hour or the way the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Whatever it was, my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I pulled up to the curb, scanning the sidewalk for my passenger. That's when I saw him. A man in his 40s wearing a dark suit that looked expensive but rumpled, like he'd been wearing it for days. His hair was disheveled, and even from inside the car I could see a wild look in his eyes. He yanked open the back door and slid in before I could even ask if he was my ride. The smell hit me immediately. A mix of stale sweat and something metallic that made my nose wrinkle. "You Mike?" he asked, his voice raspy. I nodded, trying to keep my tone casual. "That's me. Where to?" He rattled off an address in the suburbs, a good 40-minute drive from where we were. I punched it into the GPS and pulled away from the curb, stealing glances at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes darted around constantly, never settling on one spot for more than a second. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and I noticed dark stains under his fingernails. Probably just dirt, I told myself, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. We rode in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional direction from my GPS. I was about to make some small talk, anything to break the tension, when he spoke. "You ever feel like you're being watched, Mike?" I swallowed hard, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Can't say that I have," I lied, because right at that moment I felt like I was being watched very intently. He leaned forward, his face appearing between the front seats. I could smell his breath, sour and vaguely chemical. "They're always watching, always listening, but they won't get me, not this time." I nodded, trying to keep my eyes on the road. "Right, sure thing, buddy." He sat back and I breathed a small sigh of relief. But the respite was short-lived. "We need to make a detour," he said suddenly. "There's somewhere I need to go first." Warning bells started going off in my head. This was against Uber policy, not to mention potentially dangerous. "Sorry, man. I can only take you to the destination you put in the app. Company rules, you know." That's when I heard it. The soft click of a switchblade opening. My blood ran cold as I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was holding the knife casually, almost absent-mindedly as he stared out the window. "I insist," he said, his voice eerily calm. My mind raced. I'd had self-defense training, but it had never covered what to do when you're trapped in a moving vehicle with an armed, possibly deranged passenger. I considered slamming on the brakes, maybe trying to make a run for it, but at this hour on this empty stretch of road, where would I go? "Okay," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Where do you want to go?" He gave me an address and I recognized it immediately. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you'd see in a crime show where bodies get dumped. As I changed course, I frantically tried to think of a way out of this situation. My phone was mounted on the dashboard, but there was no way I could call for help without him noticing. The doors were locked, but that was as much a trap for me as it was protection. We drove in tense silence, the city giving way to industrial zones and then to the more rural outskirts. The whole time I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. "You're probably wondering what this is all about," he said, suddenly making me jump. I didn't respond, afraid that anything I said might set him off. "They took something from me," he continued, his voice taking on a manic edge. "Something precious, and now I'm going to take something from them." My mouth was dry as I asked, "Who's they?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You know who. The ones pulling all the strings, the ones who think they can play God with our lives." Great, I thought. Not just a potential murderer, but a conspiracy nut too. The perfect combination. As we neared the warehouse, my desperation grew. I had to do something, anything, to get out of this situation. That's when I noticed my gas gauge. The needle was hovering just above empty. An idea formed, risky, potentially stupid, but it was all I had. "Hey man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "and we're running low on gas. There's a station about a mile up ahead. Mind if we make a quick stop?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for his response. "Fine," he finally said. "But make it quick." I nodded, relief washing over me. As we pulled into the gas station, I saw my chance. The convenience store was lit up, a bored-looking clerk visible through the window. If I could just get inside, I could call for help. "I'll need to go in to pay," I said, reaching for my wallet. "The card reader out here is busted." His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. The knife glinted in the harsh fluorescent light of the gas station. "Don't try anything stupid," he growled. "I'll be watching." I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. As I stepped out of the car, my legs felt like jelly. I walked towards the store, hyper-aware of his eyes on my back. Just as I reached the door, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Police sirens growing louder by the second. I turned back to the car, and in that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. My passenger's face contorted with rage and fear. He flung open the car door and bolted, disappearing into the darkness beyond the gas station's lights. Seconds later, 2 police cruisers screeched into the lot, officers pouring out with guns drawn. It wasn't until one of them approached me, asking if I was okay, that I realized I was shaking. In the chaos that followed, giving statements, watching as officers searched the area, I learned the truth. My passenger was a suspect in a string of grisly murders across 3 states. The precious thing that had been taken from him? His victims' lives. The knife he'd been holding was collected as evidence, its blade still stained with blood. As for the warehouse he'd wanted me to drive to, they found 2 bodies there the next day. They never caught him. To this day, the thought that he's still out there keeps me up at night. I quit driving for Uber after that, couldn't bring myself to pick up another stranger. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I'll catch a glimpse of someone in my rearview mirror. Just for a second, in the corner of my eye. A man in a rumpled suit with wild eyes and blood under his fingernails. I know it's just my imagination, a remnant of that terrifying night. But it serves as a reminder of how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into a nightmare, and how sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're sitting right behind you asking for a ride. So the next time you're thinking about picking up a late-night fare or jumping into a stranger's car, remember my story. Because you never know who might be sliding into that back seat. And some rides, once they start, can take you places you never wanted to go. Story 15. The roar of motorcycles filled the air, drowning out the terrified screams of my family. What should have been a pleasant road trip had turned into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. As I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with fear, I realized we were running out of options and gas. It was supposed to be our big summer adventure. Me, my wife Laura, and our 2 kids, Ethan and Sophie, piled into our trusty old SUV for a cross-country drive to visit Laura's parents in Arizona. We'd been planning this trip for months, mapping out routes, booking quirky roadside motels, and making lists of all the ridiculous tourist traps we wanted to hit along the way. The first few days had been everything we'd hoped for. We'd seen the world's largest ball of twine eaten at a diner shaped like a giant donut and taken more cheesy family photos than I care to admit. Ethan, at 14, pretended to be too cool for it all, but I caught him smiling more than once. And 10-year-old Sophie was in heaven, her face constantly pressed against the window as she looked for new wonders around every turn. We were somewhere in the middle of Nevada when it happened. The landscape had turned from lush forests to arid desert, and the highway stretched out before us like a ribbon of shimmering heat. I was at the wheel, Laura dozing in the passenger seat, the kids engrossed in their tablets in the back. The peace was shattered by the sudden roar of engines. In my rearview mirror, I saw them appear as if out of nowhere, a pack of motorcycles, maybe 20 or 30 of them, rapidly gaining on us. They moved like a swarm, weaving between the sparse traffic with a kind of choreographed precision. "Wow, cool bikes," Ethan exclaimed, turning in his seat to get a better look. I felt a twinge of unease, something about the way they moved, the matching leather jackets, the purposeful way they were closing the distance. It set off alarm bells in my head. "Everyone sit tight and face forward," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's let these guys pass us." I eased off the accelerator, moving into the right lane to give them plenty of room. But as the pack drew closer, they didn't pass. Instead, they surrounded us, boxing in our SUV on all sides. Laura stirred, blinking awake. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Then her eyes widened as she took in the scene. Oh my God. The bikers were so close now I could see their faces, grim, determined expressions behind mirrored sunglasses and bandanas. This wasn't just a group out for a joyride. These men and a few women looked dangerous. "Daddy?" Sophie's small voice came from the back seat, tinged with fear. "Why are they looking at us like that?" I opened my mouth to reassure her, but the words died in my throat as one of the bikers pulled up alongside my window. He gestured for me to roll it down. Against my better judgment, I did. "You cut us off back there," he growled, his voice barely audible over the engines. "We don't take kindly to that." My mind raced. Had I cut them off? I couldn't remember seeing them at all before now, but arguing seemed like a bad idea. "I'm sorry," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "It was an accident. We didn't see you." The biker stared at me for a long moment, then his lips curled into a sneer. "Now, sorry ain't good enough. You need to be taught a lesson." He revved his engine and fell back, rejoining the pack. For a split second, I thought maybe that was it, that they'd made their point and would leave us alone. Then I saw one of the bikers reach into his jacket. "Get down!" I yelled, just as something smashed against my side mirror, shattering it. Laura screamed. The kids started crying in the back seat. Adrenaline surged through me. I stomped on the accelerator, our SUV lurching forward, but the bikers stayed with us easily, continuing to box us in. More projectiles hit our car rocks, bottles, whatever they had on hand. The rear windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. "What do they want?" Laura cried, twisting in her seat to check on the kids. "Why are they doing this?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had to get away. I weaved back and forth, looking for an opening, but the bikers moved as one, anticipating my every move. It was like they'd done this before. The speedometer crept up, 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. The SUV shuddered, pushed to its limits, but still the bikers kept pace, their engines growling hungrily around us. "Dad, look out!" Ethan's shout made me jerk my head up. One of the bikers had pulled in front of us and was slowing down, trying to force us to reduce speed. I swerved at the last second, nearly sideswiping another biker in the process. The maneuver cost us. I felt the SUV fishtail, heard the screech of tires as I fought to keep control. We spun halfway around before I managed to straighten us out, now facing the wrong way on the shoulder of the road. The bikers circled us like sharks, whooping and revving their engines. I could see the terror on my family's faces, mirroring the fear I felt in my own heart. This wasn't just harassment anymore. These people meant to hurt us. With shaking hands, I threw the SUV into drive and peeled back onto the highway, now going in the opposite direction of traffic. Horns blared as oncoming cars swerved to avoid us. In the rearview mirror, I saw the bikers regrouping, preparing to give chase once more. "Hold on!" I shouted, spinning the wheel hard. We cut across the median, tires bouncing over the rough terrain, and shot back into the correct lanes. For a moment, I thought we might have lost them in the chaos, but then I heard it. the roar of engines growing louder once more. They were coming. "Laura, call 911, I said, tossing her my phone. She fumbled with it, hands shaking as she dialed. "There's no signal," she said, voice cracking with panic. "We're in the middle of nowhere." I glanced at the gas gauge and felt my heart sink. In our frantic escape, I hadn't noticed how low we were running. The needle was hovering just above empty. The bikers were gaining on us again, spreading out across all lanes to cut off any escape routes. I searched desperately for an exit, a turnoff, anything that might give us a chance. But there was nothing but empty desert as far as the eye could see. "Daddy, I'm scared," Sophie whimpered from the back seat. Ethan had his arm around her, trying to be brave, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. "It's going to be okay," I said, wishing I believed it myself. "We're going to be okay." But as the bikers closed in once more, I knew we were running out of options. The gas gauge dipped lower with each passing second. Even if we could outrun them, we'd be stranded in the desert with no help in sight. I made a split-second decision. Spotting a gap between two of the bikers, I gunned the engine one last time and swerved hard, aiming for the shoulder of the road. We bounced and rattled as we left the pavement, dust billowing up around us. "What are you doing?" Laura cried, gripping the dashboard. "Trust me," I said, though I wasn't sure I trusted myself. I steered us further off-road, bouncing over rocks and scrub brush. The SUV wasn't made for this kind of terrain, but it was our only chance. Behind us, I could hear the bikers shouting, their engines revving as they tried to follow. We crested a small rise, and I saw it. An old abandoned gas station, its faded sign barely visible against the horizon. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. A place to make a stand. The SUV's engine coughed and sputtered as we rolled into the cracked parking lot. We'd run out of gas, but we'd made it. I threw the car into park and turned to my family. "Everyone out now. Into the building." We scrambled out of the car, the sound of approaching motorcycles growing louder by the second. The gas station's door was locked, but a well-placed kick splintered the old wood. We rushed inside into the musty darkness. "Help me!" I shouted, grabbing a heavy shelf and dragging it in front of the door. Laura and Ethan joined me, piling anything we could find against the entrance. We huddled together in the back of the store, listening to the bikers arrive outside. The roar of engines, shouts of anger, the sound of fists pounding on the barricaded door. "What do we do now?" Laura whispered, holding Sophie close. I looked around the abandoned store, searching for anything we could use to defend ourselves. An old broom, some empty bottles. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "We hold out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Someone will come along eventually. A highway patrol car, another traveler. We just have to wait them out." As if in answer to my words, I heard a new sound cutting through the bikers. Shouts, sirens, faint but growing louder. The pounding on the door stopped. Through a crack in the boarded-up window, I saw the bikers looking at each other in panic. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. Moments later, 2 highway patrol cars pulled into the lot, lights flashing. I felt a wave of relief so strong it made my knees weak. As we emerged from our makeshift fortress, blinking in the harsh sunlight, I hugged my family close. We were safe. We had survived. In the days that followed, as we gave statements to the police and tried to piece our lives back together, I couldn't shake the memory of those terrifying moments on the highway. The random nature of it, the senseless violence, it had shaken my faith in the world. But as I looked at my family, at the strength and resilience they had shown, I felt something else too. Pride, love, and a fierce determination to never let fear rule our lives. We didn't finish our road trip that summer, but we did promise ourselves that we'd try again next year. Because sometimes the only way to overcome your fears is to face them head-on with the people you love by your side. And next time, I thought with a grim smile, we'd be sure to keep the gas tank full.